Recording.
Ready, set?
Yeah, we are ready.
Are we a go, Ms. Wedderburn?
We are go.
Everyone, thank you for joining us for our first in a series discussion, if you will. This is Race and Racism, a discussion series. Today, in particular, we're going to talk about racism and the pandemic. And I'd like to start off by framing the discussion. But before I start framing the discussion, just want to give you a little bit of background. This particular speaker series is hosted by the Seminar in Race and Racism in the US or the United States. We have a 4-course meal, if you will, once every Tuesday for the next 4 Tuesdays, or 3 from here, if you will. And we will cover various topics that speak to or can speak to institutional racism. Doesn't mean that we won't talk about other types of racism like interpersonal racism, but these will be the overarching topic areas. But we can't get around the pandemic, and we have to talk about the pandemic. We have to frame our discussions around the right now, if you will. So I have some phenomenal experts in the field joining us for this discussion this evening and for the rest of the speaker series, and I'll introduce them in a little while. How we will play this is that I will provide a framing presentation that will last for about 10 minutes or so. Then I will introduce our guest discussants, or our discussants, excuse me. I just told them that it's a free-for-all, so they're no longer guests. So I will introduce our discussants. We will have a discussion around racism and the pandemic and any other topics that come up during our discussion. Time permitted, we'll open up for a general Q&A, and then we'll close up shop. My class itself will jump on another Zoom and continue for the rest of the evening. And so that's how we'll go, and I'll start right now. We can start the history of where did racism begin, but for framing our discussion tonight, we'll start in Jamestown, Point Comfort, August 1619, where we know that there were 19 Africans, but some of us might not know as thoroughly that these 19 Africans were part of a captured slave ship, first bound for a Spanish colony, but then sold further up north in the British. What's debatable is the purpose. Was it short-term indentured service, or was it lifelong slave? Well, decades to come taught us that it was a lifelong slave. It was not indentured servitude at all. This became, in America at least, cornerstone for the social, political, economic institution, where there became a caste system, if you will, between Africans and non-Africans, or Europeans at this particular time. They weren't even European Americans, they were just Europeans at this point, not to diminish anyone during this time. It was clear that even early on, African workers were placed in separate yet unequal queues. More of this defining the difference spoke to Africans not being named even on the rolls. Their age, their arrival date was not included, contrary to the European inhabitants. Africans were hostages. They weren't visitors. They were subjected to unspeakable torture. You can read it, but it's true. Rape, beatings, they were gifts. They satisfied debts, mortgages. They were, anything you can think of as far as property. Africans arrived as imports, not as humans, not as people. And this lasted for 250 years, a quarter of a millennium, and it was legal. Slavery took such a hold and informed racism that it took 750,000 deaths during a civil war, an assassination of a president, and the passing of the 13th Amendment to end slavery. So much so that It's almost offensive, excuse me, it is offensive that the 13th Amendment had it to say in writing that there will be no slavery, involuntary servitude. This is an exact quote from the 13th Amendment. It shall not exist in America or the United States. So it ended. But what lasted was this pseudoscience of eugenics, if you will, that still provided a playing field to justify the debasement of Black people during this time. It defined Black people as dumb, even though it was illegal to teach them how to read. Lazy, which justified whipping. Immoral, Black people were immoral, which justified rape and forced breeding, right? Black people were considered criminal when they fought back from being tortured. It might remind you of some things happening today. America doubled down, though. They increased the numbers. See, European Americans came to America, immigrants came to America, and largely left their racial and other countrymen identities in their home country, but came to America and automatically became white, automatically became top tier, power structured white, privileged, if you will, as long as there was one caveat, as long as you behaved, then you too can become white. This happened with so many different nationalities and ethnicities: Czech, Hungarians, Germans, Irish, Albanians, Swedes, Russians, Turks. It continues. See, no one was white before they got to America, because everyone else before they got to America was identified by their national or ethnic identity. But here in America, they're white. Doubled down, increased the numbers. And then as they did so, America taught newcomers how and that they should or could be racist. Immigrants distanced themselves from what they might have considered to be the lowest rung, if you will, Blacks. They took hold of their white positionality. In many cases, became hostile toward this lowest caste. And this was acceptable among immigrants. Case in point, 1863. Irish immigrants were so upset that they had to fight the Civil War that they took it out on Blacks with riots and raids against Black people. They took it out on Blacks. Almost 100 years later, one of the largest or biggest race riots actually was spearheaded because a Black veteran wanted to move his family into a community of white people, mostly Italian and Polish. America did not just inform individuals on how to be racist, it informed everyone on how to be racist through institutional racism. But it taught whites how to be racist, newcomers who became whites how to be racist. It taught other immigrants how to be racist, for that matter. Even other marginalized groups of color that were not Black taught them how to be racist or where they stand, if you will, in the structure. Unfortunately, it taught Blacks how to be racist too. It taught Blacks not necessarily the form of racism that they can deliver themselves, but it taught them racism, if you will, and it taught them through employment, employability, education, healthcare disparities. It taught Blacks where they stood in this racism structure or caste system. America keeps doing it, keeps doubling down yet again with eugenics or this biological determinism. And we know social Darwinism, but just to frame our discussion, keep us on the same playing field, if you will, for our discussion, some backdrop, some of the things that we've been talking about in the last 2 weeks, if you will, through the class, through the course, just making sure that we keep everybody up and moving around this, is that African Americans by this time were considered to be innately inferior. This is a story that was spun, right? Using this biological determinism to suggest that Africans were the lowest rung, Europeans were the highest rung, and there's nothing that they can do. There's nothing that an African American can do to boost, increase, enhance their intelligence. That's just the way they are. That's the way it is. Two, more like Tigger two, cultural deprivation. In addition to social Darwinism, and with social Darwinism, suggested that no, it's not necessarily that there's this social Darwinism or this innate inferiority. People are tabula rasa, blank slates from John Locke's work. People's environmental experiences influence their intellectual ability. This morphed to suggest that the reason African Americans are less intelligent is because of racism and oppression in the communities. That in turn morphed into suggesting that the Black family is culturally deprived. The best that a Black family can do to develop their children and adults for that matter is up to and possibly through adolescence. This is intentional, I would say. Sean Coleman, it's up for debate, right? If racism wanted to be abolished, it could be. There have been talk across the several centuries around abolishing racism. Sure, some folks have said, send those Africans back to Africa. Don't know where they go or where they send them, but they said send them back to Africa in some cases, in some regard. But racism has a benefit. Let's talk about it in the short story because this is just a framing of it, right? The short story is that it's power, it's capitalism, and it's white. Anytime that the United States of America needed to move forward economically, it was on the backs of Blacks. Blacks sacrificed their space, their well-being. Slavery is an example, but there are other examples since slavery. Jim Crow laws, the employment issues that have been historically problematic. Housing, economics, and let's talk about that a little bit in just a couple of slides. But let me just say, in a space that I ended my last class last week, generally speaking, the discussion section, is that without slavery, there would be no America as we know it. Absolutely, hands down, there would be no America. I mean, America is one of the youngest, if not the youngest superpower in America. I'm sorry, in the world, excuse me, based on slavery, free labor, and abuse of labor after slavery, for that matter. Derek Bell might suggest that 12% of the market is taken up by Blacks. Blacks, they account for about 12% of buying power, if not more by now, for that matter, if you will. Blacks also happen to spend more of their income than white, largely because whites have more disposable income and have more cushion, if you will, from their income. But businesses profit from the sales in Black urban communities. Profits also come from law enforcement agencies, prisons, and other such institutions. Millions and millions of dollars are made economically, but in housing, when you sell a community with high pricing, so high to imply, if not say literally, that Blacks cannot buy or rent in this community. Conversely, millions more are made in rentals and homes in poor urban communities. There's a need economically for the Black dollar. And now for the Black positionality. It's, the Blacks need to be there according to capitalism, right? I call it the white ruse. This is a Sean Coleman phrase that I'm massaging actually for this class. The white ruse. If Blacks weren't there, then the poor whites will see who their real enemy is. If Blacks weren't there to be hated by the poor whites or to feel by the poor whites that at least I'm not Black, then they will start to remove the cloth over their eyes. They will start to remove the blindfold that they have, understanding that the real economic enemy is their white counterpart who is positioning themselves in a higher socioeconomic status. Elected representatives have been doing this for years. And so here, we're still navigating this institutional racism. Education with opportunity gap, economics with housing, also spending, jobs, healthcare, wealth, law, we're still dealing with driving while Black, cocaine versus crack sentencing, now it's opioid, if you will. We're still dealing with institutional racism issues. Juxtaposed with daily overt and covert racism by interpersonal actions or transactions by people that feel that they have support, leverage from the institutional space as well, right? These things are, can be, just for example, using racial epithets, refusing service. These things can be from following a Black person in a store or not providing them service or letting white people jump in line in front of them, like happened to my son and I. The attempt happened about a year or so ago. Clenching your purse, if you will, right? In Black neighborhoods, when you wouldn't clench it in other spaces, or crossing the street to avoid a racial minority. May suggests that the pandemic has made these issues even more challenging in some shape, form, or fashion. These issues of racism continue institutionally and interpersonally. Dr. Davis and I are writing a book chapter that includes some of these statistics around police brutality and the Black male during the pandemic. I'll just read some of them. Blacks are reported to have 3 times more likely unable to have basic needs for their families. Blacks are more likely over their white counterparts to be a central or frontline worker, also having less ability to have childcare, right? Or work virtually or remotely, being more at risk at getting COVID-19, more at risk of getting COVID-19 and bring it back into not just the family, but the community, more at risk. The coronavirus-related deaths for Blacks are 1.7 times greater than whites by rate, if you will. And Blacks are more likely than whites to have a family or someone close to them die because of COVID. Some of these references that I use today are also some of the works that we're reviewing in our course. But let's talk about it some more. I am greatly honored to have Dr. Taharee Jackson, who is the founder and tone setter in chief, her words, of Dr. Taharee Consulting. Let me say that 10 times fast. Dr. Taharee Consulting. Dr. Jackson is also a lead equity specialist and trainer at the Equity Literacy Institute. Skipping down because it's so much, at the University of Maryland at College Park, he served as professor and researcher of the Minority and Urban Education in the Department of Teaching and Learning, Policy, and Leadership. Dr. Jackson holds a magna cum laude BA from Harvard University in psychology and Spanish, a master's of education degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Human Development and Psychology, and a PhD from Emory University in teacher education, multicultural education, and urban education reform. I had to take 2 breaths for that. But look, let's show her off a little bit. Let's see if I can do this. I tried this with, Nicholas, my technology advisor, was trying to get me to work this out. Oh yeah, this show and share Dr. Jackson's work. She's recently written 2 times fast, how whiteness works, why white murderers get to have a bad day, and victims of color are villainized. She has published here several times. She has several works here. I'm not going to read anything to you, but she does provide a positionality statement, which I think is very important. And she just wrote this piece maybe last week or so, if you will, right? And then I'm going to scroll down quickly for my viewers that she has more. She has more. So go to drtaharee.medium.com and you'll find some of her works. Soon come is drtaharee.com, her website coming. My good friend, good colleague, Dr. Julius Davis, I am cashing in on what he said to me earlier or last year. Hey, Sean, because he calls me Sean, or Dr. Coleman, if you need a speaker, I've done some critical race theory work. I have a book. I've done some work, and him and I worked together on a couple of grants and a couple of publications ourselves. Dr. Julius Davis is the University System of Maryland, Wilson H. Elkins Associate Professor of Mathematics Education. Let me stop there and say that's big for those who weren't paying attention, right? He is also the director of the Center for Research and Mentoring of Black Male Students and Teachers at Bowie State University. I was going to say here because we're just virtual, but yes, here at Bowie State University. There is a lot. So I'm going to move on down to the bio that I snagged, right? Dr. Davis has two main strands of research focused on Black students and teachers in urban and suburban schools. Dr. Davis holds a doctorate in mathematics education from Morgan State University, a master's degree in middle secondary instruction with a concentration in mathematics from Edinburgh University. Dr. Davis, you have to help me with that. And a bachelor's degree in mathematics education from Lincoln University. Woo-wee. Dr. Davis has a book coming out. No, it's out already, I believe. I'm going to ask Dr. Davis to speak a little bit more to this book, as well as Dr. Jackson speak more to her work when we transition shortly, because blowing this up, it doesn't do well for the screen, but it's Black Males Matter. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Davis to finish that for us. A shout out to the inaugural Institute for Restorative Justice and Practices virtual conference that is this Friday. Jump on, guys, this Friday, April 9th. It goes from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. I'm a member of the Restorative Justice and Practice Committee, if you will, or Institute for that matter. Look, we have some powerhouses here. Please join us because it's some powerful dialogue here that's going to happen on Friday. And then I'm going to stop sharing if I can. Transition out of there. And let's start the discussion. If you can, my friends. Ms. Wedderburn, can you, if you don't mind, screen all three of us? So again, my friends, my good colleagues, thank you for being here with us today, because as I mentioned prior to us jumping on recorded, that is, we can co-facilitate, I can facilitate, we can do one another, you can make me the heavy on tough tough discussions, whatever you want to do, right? Before I start though, is there a highlight that I missed of your work? Because I want to make sure that I honor your work.
First off, you embarrassed us, but I think we will take it because it's you, Sean. We were just talking about this before we got on, how such grace you have, We can't even really say nothing to you, but we know it's all in love.
Well, all I did was highlight you guys. I was trying to highlight your work because I want everyone to know the good work that you're doing, and every chance I get, I want to scream it.
Well, I'm going to take the same tack as Dr. Davis and say you are so gracious, and you just made me feel so much better about myself. But I'm also going to give a shameless plug because this Sunday, April 11th, I believe at 4 o'clock, I'm actually participating in an invited presidential session at the American Educational Research Association annual conference. So if anyone's going to AERA and they want to hear more about race in education, and specifically about whiteness and anti-Blackness in teaching and teacher education. I'm actually going to be giving that talk and participating with folks like Rita Coley and Wayne Au and some really great critical race theorists and critical white studies people. So I actually am going to be even more shameless and tell people that I'm speaking for AERA this Sunday. So
that's not shameless. I asked you. This is the platform to do it, my friend. Thank you, actually. Thank you. Dr. Davis, real quick, can you give us the rest of the title of your book?
So now you're gonna put me on the spot to know the name of the full name of the book. It's called Black Males Matter, a blueprint for creating schools, academic and social environments for the success of Black male students. Now I chopped it up, I messed it up, but that's the task when you have a long name for a book, and it's fairly new in your lexicon. So yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys, the great work that you're doing in the field. And I appreciate, again, I can't thank you enough for being here. Let's get to talking, right? There's some themes that we had, we have virtually sort of discussed, if you will, but, the discussions can be organic. It doesn't have to be in any order. And so let's just go, colleagues. The pandemic, the outrage, and setting the stage, if you will. I have a couple of places that I want to start, but you guys can help me wherever you want to be in this discussion. Initially I was thinking maybe we should start with what makes the COVID-19 pandemic, something particular. But maybe I can merge that concept with, we haven't forgotten about the murder of George Floyd, have we? I mean, that was last year, and although the trial started last week or so, I don't want to lose sight that there was some protests happening around the world with regard to George Floyd's murder, right? And racism and police brutality in general. What do you guys' thoughts?
I'm going to be a gentleman, if you don't mind, and yield to my good colleague.
Yeah, I have multiple thoughts, and luckily for you, they're fresh because I just shared these yesterday morning on a radio show in Brooklyn. I think it's called Free Radio Brooklyn, and I sat down with a radio DJ and we talked through the trial of Derek Chauvin. Right?
Yes.
This is the case of George Floyd. This is the unrightful murder of George Floyd. This is not the trial of George Floyd, right? This is the trial of Derek Chauvin. And I think that's important because words matter, right? Words are weapons and language shapes thought. So even just the semantics of how we frame that is really important. So what I think my greatest contribution here is to say that when I have been called upon all throughout 2020 and even now in 2021 to talk about the pandemic and racism, what I generally talk about is how we are experiencing myriad pandemics at the same time, right? Because the pandemic, the global health emergency pandemic of COVID-19 really just illuminated the prevailing pandemics of racism, classism, sexism, ageism, and all the other struggles for racial equity and social justice. So I'm actually really excited that, I shouldn't say excited, but it is a blessing in disguise, right? It's a silver lining that the pandemic came at the same time as sort of these virulent spates of violence, specifically against Black people. But as you know, Dr. Coleman, I'm actually multiracial and I'm Black and Asian.
Yes.
So what's interesting is that I started 2020 talking about anti-Asian racism, right? Because that's when we saw people being spat upon. We saw violent attacks against Asian people. We saw bat fried rice t-shirts, right? We saw the type of posts that the Cherokee County, Georgia sheriff's spokesman, I think Jay Butler or Jay Baker, had sort of, COVID-19 made in China, right? Like we saw that at the beginning of 2020, and now we're seeing that again. But what I don't think people realize is that we have anti-Black racism every day. We have anti-Asian racism every day, right? And you talked about it beautifully when you discussed individual, interpersonal, and institutional racism. So I am not glad that we have a global health emergency, because people of color, people experiencing poverty, people who are parents, especially single parents, are experiencing a disproportionate amount of suffering. But what I'm glad the pandemic did was bring multiple pandemics to the fore, of which anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and anti-poverty, classism, all were sort of, they were brought to the fore, and we have to talk about them now. So I'm just going to take advantage of the momentum of the moment, because I think without the coronavirus, people wouldn't be excited or wouldn't feel forced or compelled to talk about racism as much as they are now.
I appreciate you seeing the glass half full, Dr. Jackson. That's what I know about you.
Actual optimist all the time, every time, every day.
How do we think that, racism, I tried to lay some of the framework, and of course you guys know that that's just like the tip of the iceberg, clearly not enough to dive, deep, but racism has been around for a long time, right? We've been saying that racism has been around for a long time also. Why do we think that now it's caught fire across the world?
So if I could jump in, I wanted to kind of build on Dr. Jackson's comments. I was thinking about some of the remarks for tonight, and I was gonna say, I've been studying racism for a long time. And then I was thinking, like, shucks, you were born into racism.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been living it and studying it your whole life. And I say that as a context that I think racism is a really real concept. And throughout my life, I've seen too many people that I've lost in my family and community due to the impact of racism. And so when Dr. Jackson was talking about, this pandemic piece, I think that for Black people, racism is that never-ending pandemic that Dr. Coleman and I and the future Dr. Dowry talk about in terms of our chapter, about the pandemic, where the pandemic, police brutality, and racism kind of come together. This is a story that we have lived throughout most of our life. And I think I often ask people, when did racism stop? Like, when did it end? Can you pinpoint the date and the time for which that happened? And so given that racism impacts Black people at such a serious level on an everyday basis, I also am very careful about the language that we use around eliminating racism. Like when we say eradicate racism or eliminate racism, what do we really mean? And what are the implications for that? And because, in your remarks, Dr. Coleman, you talked about racism being connected to power and capitalism and whiteness. I've never known anybody in power to just give up their power without a fight. And so when people say that they're committed to being anti-racist or they're committed to racism, what does that really mean to them? And who are the people that are impacted when they think about racism in their lives? And I'll hold my comments there.
I don't know how to follow that. To be honest with you, Dr. Davis, I don't know how to follow that. I think part of this discussion is that the three of us in our same and yet different at the same time, because we are a non-monolithic, or part of a non-monolithic group, if you will, have been born in some shape, form, or fashion into racism, and that's sort of all we know, even if it's tacitly, right? Even if we couldn't really put our fingers on it, if it wasn't necessarily overt. Now, I think because it's our work, we can see even the implicit racism, not just the overt. So yeah, I had this idea that, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to go right behind Dr. Davis and follow up on him. But I mean, what you said was powerful.
Well, I think it also speaks to why I use critical race theory. It has provided that lens for me to understand that racism is always present. It's so stubborn that you can't get rid of it. And what we think was once racism just changes its form. And we have to be very vigilant as Black people to see the continuous ways that racism manifests itself In the words of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, in all areas of people activity, I don't know an area of life that racism doesn't impact, and especially for Black people. And I say that because I center Black people in my work unapologetically. And for me, I think about what does it mean for us to do for ourselves in a space where whiteness prevails and racism is always present.
Well, so can I just nuance that slightly? Not to pick an intellectual fight with either critical race theorist or Derek Bell or Dr. Davis or Dr. Coleman, but I want to add a Taharee Jackson spin on that, right? So I think I agree actually with everything that both of you just said, with the caveat that we are born into racist systems, but we are not born into racist thinking, right? So from where I sit, I tend to be more of a nurturist, right? In the psychological debate of nature and nurture, I know based on my background in psychology, my life experience, and also having worked with the youngest students, right, in preschool, and even one year I had a class of 0 to 3, right, because my background is in early childhood education and human development. What I know is that hate is not innate, right? And so racism is actually manufactured. And anything that can be manufactured can be destroyed. Anything that can be learned can be unlearned. And anything that is fabricated can be destroyed. So part of the reason so I also use critical race theory and specifically critical whiteness as a framework. I always have as a researcher. But to start, Derek Bell, and the co-founders of critical race theory, Alan Friedman and Kimberly Crenshaw, there is an agreement among critical race theorists in the tenet of racial realism, right? Which is that not only is it real, but it's permanent. Now, what I appreciate, Dr. Coleman, is your treatise on why it's valuable and why it's real. And I actually agree with you that it is profitable, it is beneficial, it is rooted in power. But I actually depart with Derek Bell in the sense that I actually don't think it's permanent. And let me just give you a hopeful example. Actually, maybe it's not hopeful, but maybe it's just, as Dr. Davis said, a reinstantiation of racism because, people are always going to find a way to sort themselves, but maybe does it have to be on race, right? Race is a lazy shortcut. Race allows you to look at someone's skin color and categorize human bodies by melanin, right? But what I'm starting to see is now, I feel like health status is the new racism, right? We are recognizing who has access, to the COVID vaccine and all that. And what's interesting is that it still reinstantiates racism because Black people in particular and people of color in general have disproportionate access to the COVID vaccine. But I'm watching the inception of things like vaccine passports, where you can't move about the world and you can't move about the country unless you've been vaccinated. I'm watching, antibody test status. If you can produce an antibody test, then you can come. But if you can't produce a negative, a positive antibody test, you can't come. So I guess what I'm saying is we maybe as humans, maybe where I'm too Pollyanna-ish, is that as we as humans are always going to figure out a way to categorize and separate ourselves according to some sort of arbitrary hierarchy. But I'm not convinced that it has to be race for the rest of the time we are living. And I hope it's not, because my skin color is not something I should have to change in order to thrive and self-actualize. So I just
could I pose a question to Dr. Jackson?
Jump in. Yeah, jump in.
So in terms of your point about like the racist thinking and the learned behavior, I'm wondering how the institutionalization and the systematic nature of racism fits into your thinking about it being learned and can be broken and fabricated, because systems don't quite work the same way as some of the examples that you shared. And I think one pertinent example, given that we're all in education, let's take, for example, the curriculum. The curriculum throughout the entire United States is based on whiteness and a central focus on white maleness. That to me impacts thinking, but it is also institutionalized and in the very nature of the fabric of most of the school systems that we exist. But we have a cadre of people saying that they're anti-racist, but that has not changed yet in the very nature of the institution that we have the ability to control. Speak to where you think like that whole like learned, fabricated can fit into like the institutionalized and the systematic nature of racism.
Like Dr. Jackson, I'm a fan, but when you said that you disagree with Derek Bell, I'm here too. I'm here for it.
I'm going to roll up my sleeves because I can see that I'm outnumbered. But okay, let's do this. So, like I said, I didn't want to pick an intellectual fight, but I'm never one to shy away from one. No, I'm kidding. So let me just say this in all levity, but then also in all seriousness. So, Dr. Davis, what I appreciate is the gravity of your question is not lost on me. So when I went to Emory to earn my PhD, I specifically knew that having a teaching force in this country of 82 to 90% of teachers being white was highly problematic. And I was definitely a fan of Julie Lantzman, who said, wait a minute, we keep locating academic failure in these Black boys and these Black students and these students of color, but white females and white people do most of the educating. So let's start asking questions about who's teaching. And I actually went a step further and said, no, let's look at teacher educators. Who is teaching teachers and what are they teaching teachers and why? The reason that I am so adamant about infiltrating and interrupting and eradicating whiteness and white racial dominance and white hegemony in teacher education is because education is the largest site, not only of socialization, we know that from Joel Spring, but it's also the largest site of emancipation and liberation. Knowledge is power. So if we can infiltrate the institution, not only of P through 12, P through 20, whatever education, but specifically teacher education and the way teachers are prepared, we can leverage education as a weapon for good, right? It takes time, right? And I never like to invoke him, but you know who really understood that principle? Hitler, with his Nazi youth programs. Hitler said, if you give me the youth of Germany and the youth of Europe, I will change this country and I will change Europe in one generation, right? So I'm not looking to Hitler for any of my ideological prowess, but what I'm saying is that he understood that education was the site of liberation. This is a fight, right? You just said, like, we were born fighting. If you are Black, if you are Asian, if you are anything other than white, you were born fighting, right? Literally fighting for your life. And so I'd like to not maybe weaponize education, but use and co-opt for good the weapon that education is. So I actually do think that we need to address teachers and teacher educators so they then can go create warriors in the fight for racial equity and social justice.
So I agree with some of what you're saying, right? I agree with the spirit of what you're saying. I'm not sure about the references, but you beat me up with that, you win, right? You win. I think that indeed, and that's the work that we do. We go and we educate teachers, leaders, schools leaders, district leaders on cultural diversity, inclusion, and eliminating while reducing the opportunity gaps in education. Absolutely. But I actually, while you were talking, it made me think about pre-Brown v. Board of Education. And what made me think about it there is while racism was very clearly in our face during that age or that time in the mid 20th century, largely, and you guys probably know this history as well, if not better than I do, largely the push wasn't for integration. The push was, hey guys, go do what you're doing, right? Just make sure that we can get to the places, get to the busing, get to the location, get to the spaces that we need to educate our children because we're doing just fine, actually. And so I wonder if there necessarily needs to be a change in the in the US system, or does it need to be a liberation factor, if you will, right, of America, and I don't know if there's a combination of both. I like both and scenarios, but I don't know if there's a combination of both. If the powers that be aren't going to relinquish the institutional powers, then why not take my ball and go play at another
moving briefly. I'm well, you can't see me behind my mask. But let me just say this really quickly because I know I'm verbose. So what you and Dr. Davis have said is full of veracity, right? Power concedes nothing without a demand. That is Frederick Douglass all day, every day. Love that quote, right? Power concedes nothing without a demand. So what I appreciate about people saying, why would someone want to abdicate their power? Why would white people want to give up their racial privilege? Okay. Well, I've actually written that, right? Like I wrote an article, it's called The Case for Anti-Racism, right? It's literally about the principle of interest convergence and why white people or any empowered person, a man, a straight person, an able-bodied person, would ever want to surrender their privilege. But the question I always try to sort of ask coordinatingly, right, which is sort of why would people want to give up their power? The real question for me is, how did you get your power? Because power that was unrightfully stolen and asserted is not yours to surrender, it is not yours to give, and it is not yours to share. Now, you talked about the pseudoscience that had us to believe for centuries, and even now, that white people stand atop a hierarchy of the racial structure, right? They are smartest, and they're mutable, and they can change, and they can become even smarter. They're moral, they're not lazy, they're not shiftless, right? But that's hoodoo science, Joyce King would say. That is hoodoo science. So if you gained power illegitimately, why am I asking you for something that you shouldn't have? So that's all I want to say about that, and I'll be quiet.
All right, thank you.
So and to your point about asking for the power, because I think that that's one point that we are on the same page for. I don't think that you have to ask for your power. I think that you have to take it, but there are consequences for taking your power. If you think about, and if you let me frame this from the perspective of Black history, most of our leaders who have fought for anything that they have thought was worthwhile for Black people, the majority of our leaders were assassinated. And so when we think about like what it means to try to demand or fight for your power, there are consequences to that. And to me, that is the real element of racism that gets lost in our intellectual conversations, that there is a real power force behind this that often leads to lives, and only Black people and other groups are asked to be nonviolent when it comes down to power. And so I'm not saying Black people go out and execute violence, but we have to realize that the true nature of the fight that we're dealing with racism is not just in education. It is just not in one sector of life. And the fact that it's institutionalized and systematic means that it's totally intertwined into so many intersections of life that deal with power, and many of which Dr. Coleman have laid out when it comes to capitalism, international warfare. All of those are the stronghold that keep racism in place because it's a global phenomenon. When you study Black children in Canada, Jamaica, whatever have you, you find the same conditions that you see here in the US. And so when we talk about the systematic and institutionalized nature of racism, this stronghold is bigger than thinking and learned behavior. It ingrains it into the fabric of the systems that we deal with. And even as Black people, when you take on positions that are in white institutions, it impacts the decision makings that you have that are intended to be liberatory. And I think the shared structure that you were kind of laying out with regards to like the power structure, who wants to give it up, that's in the nature of liberation right there. Like, how can there be true liberation if the people who are being oppressed don't get an education that teaches them liberation? And when most of the teacher educators don't know anything about liberation, so what are they teaching? If you even use some of the new terminology, social justice, culturally relevant, most teacher educators don't come from that perspective. And the perspective that you come from, Dr. Jackson, is a rarity. So how do we then change the system when the few of us who have the consciousness and the wherewithal to think about liberation in a true context for our people don't occupy the spaces of power? We basically have to fight for them in every space that we have.
I just want to follow up really quickly, and because this is actually exactly where I was going with my point. Your questions are golden, right? Because part of the reason that I ever became a preschool teacher, right? Which you don't need 2 degrees from Harvard for, right? Like everybody thought I was crazy. But part of the reason that I decided to be a preschool teacher after that 2nd degree was because I knew about generational transformation and I was in it for the long haul, right? I had a long-term trajectory, I had a long-term plan to make sure that I was creating new types of people, right? Influencing new types of thinking. But then I thought, oh my God, wait a minute. I'm only going to be doing this 30 kids at a time, and I might teach for 30 years. How can I expand my influence? So then I became a teacher of teachers, a teacher of teacher educators, and a teacher of professors. So I exponentially grew my influence. What underlies my overall strategy for overturning racism and all forms of oppression, I sum it up with infiltrate, co-opt, and transform. Part of what I did with my students was to say, look, you as teachers are going to go into some really racist systems. And by the way, I have, again, semantics are important for me. So we've got to remember that systems are made up of people and institutions are made up of individuals. So it's not like some edifice or building, right? Like the Department of Education is a building that houses people who run it. So as long as you're focused on the people in an institution, and in the military, they would call it hearts and minds, right? As long as you're worried about transforming people, then you can transform systems because no system is independent of people. So first we infiltrate, right? We play by the rules until we can change the game. So we as anti-racist operatives, if you will, go into classrooms and transform schools, right? We co-opt our power, right? We use whatever power we have attached to our identities, whether it's the white privilege that we have as white teachers, whether it's class privilege, and we use our money for various, social justice activity and anti-racist advocacy, right? We infiltrate systems, we co-opt our power, and we transform systems. Because what I appreciate about what both you and Dr. Coleman said is that if you've got an inherently racist institution and you just add more and sprinkle in some people of color, right, which is what we did during desegregation and which is what companies do for diversity. We're just going to sprinkle in some people like pepper on potatoes or like chips in a cookie. We're just going to sprinkle you in. No, you have to transform yourself. You have to become an institution that is inherently anti-racist. And you have to become liberatory. So I do think all of that is possible. But number one, I think we lack understanding around it. I think we lack political will. And I think we lack patience because it does take time. That's my tack.
I think that the 3 of us are saying, or overlapping, saying some things that are slightly different, but definitely overlapping. Not to be a politician, but I split the middle on it, if you will.
You must vote. I'm so sorry, sir. The gentleman from Maryland, what does he vote? Yes, yay or nay?
I split the middle, and this is a space where I have a both and. I do think there's space for a libertarian approach, right? But everyone's not going to move there. And so for those who aren't moving or moving fast enough, if you will, then I think that there needs to be some support to educate, inform, provide the education to give them a pathway towards libertation, right? So, liberation, excuse me. So to me, it's a both and. I don't want to focus just on one when I know that we are in both sort of buckets, if you will, right? And I see Dr. Davis is waiting for me to finish because I see you about to jump to you're about to pounce on us, Dr.
No, brother, I'm listening. I'm learning right now.
I think that there's, I've been trained to use a Trojan horse approach in the mainstream environment, right? Just like you're saying, Dr. Jackson, go in, sound like look like you're friendly. This is a gift, right? And then, then pounce out the back of the Trojan horse and talk about culturally sensitive learning environments, right? For example, right? Race and racism, equity and inclusion, opportunity, closing the opportunity gaps, all those things. But there are a number of folks who are already there, and it doesn't have to be a Trojan horse approach. Let's go and do that work directly, right? But I think that's there. As we're talking, and you know, one of the topics is the pandemic. And what I think that you guys are telling me, right, and we're talking, is that there is not racism and a pandemic or racism in a pandemic. There is racism, and we happen to be in a pandemic. But racism is through and through and is operating essentially the same. It's just the pandemic is accentuating some of the weight of racism, especially for those who have traditionally been placed at risk.
I think that we probably agree to that point. I think that I wanted to share a quick story. So like I met Dr. Jackson through one of our, I don't know if you consider Marvin, Dr. Lynn, your mentor or whatever. I don't know how you describe him and his impact on your life, right? So we know him as a critical race theorist. We know him as a researcher of Black male teachers. And I wanted to kind of share this quick story when I was a doc student. I was talking to him and another senior scholar in our field, and we were talking about whether you wait until you get tenure to talk about race and racism, or do you talk about it now? And Dr. Lynn was very adamant, you do it now. You don't wait until tenure and promotion to do that. And I said that to kind of build on what Dr. Coleman and what you said, Dr. Jackson, that a lot of times, you know, our expectation is that many of our people will infiltrate spaces and make a space for others to come behind them. But a lot of times, similar to that tenure and promotion scenario, people get into those spaces and then they forgot that they were supposed to be talking about race and racism now that they got tenure and promotion. Just like when they got these positions, they were supposed to open up the door for other Black people and make policies that fit them and not just take care of their own selves. And so I say that to say that in the context of our white teacher educators, our white teachers and just white folks in general, I wonder, do they want to change? And when you make the point about like believing that transformation can happen, I don't know that folks want to change. And I think that when like, so for example, you know, and I hate talking about this, and I think this is the most current example, like when Donald Trump started running for office, and then people started talking about all these different white folks that were voting for him and all these things. And it's like, these were the same people that you were interacting with before he voted for Trump, but now you see them differently because he voted for Trump. Like, that's to me the nature of racism. Like, people know the language. That's the one thing that I have a problem with about how we intellectualize things. Once people learn the language and they say the words that they know they need to say, like culturally responsive, culturally relevant, anti-racist, and all that stuff, they start using the jargon, but who they are is naturally still intact, and they still operate in that way. They just use the political language that is of the day. Because in the words of something that my father used to say with protests, when we used to talk about race growing up, white folks know that Black people are going to protest for a little while and then they're going to stop. And I say that to say that as Black people, and this is how I live my life, and this is how I kind of see this work, we don't have a choice. It's either we're fighting for us collectively to move forward, or we're not doing the work that we need to do. Because short-term protests are not impactful. While they may raise awareness about the issue, but what are you doing after that is what we have to be thinking about to change the institution and the systems that impact our people on an everyday basis. And I say that because, you know, Dr. Coleman and I, we get to talk all the time. So I get the benefit from that. And when we meet with our team often, I say, I have too many people to thank for where I'm at right now. And there's no way in my lifetime that I could give them thanks for where I'm at right now. The only thing that I can do is to continue to try to make a way for other Black people to come through just like I have. And I say that to say that as Black people we have a responsibility to make a way for others who don't and those who are coming behind us. And I think that we forget that sometimes when we get a quote unquote position of power in whiteness.
I can go with that, Dr. Davis, and I would add to that, one of the readings that we had for the class was Race and the Epistemologies of Ignorance. And one of those types, if you will, of ignorance, or one of the fallacies and responses to racism is that some in power would say that they've already done enough for Black people. And so, I mean, they go through a list of everything that they think that they've done for Black people, and so therefore Black people should be grateful, right? And as I explain it, it reminds me of an abusive relationship. As soon as you, from a psychology perspective, as soon as the abuser is challenged, right? They oftentimes, of course not every time, but one of the responses is, well, I've done this for you. I've done that for you. I've done this for you. You should be grateful. And they'll, as my term of the evening, only for the evening, they'll double down and say, you can't go anywhere else and do better and be better. And so many of the sort of the institutional establishment, the white power, take on that perspective. Some of them, as you ask rhetorically, do they want to change, right? Some of them feel that they've changed or they've done enough. I've done several, we all have, right? Done several teacher trainings around constructive social interactions, right? Teacher-student relationship quality. And invariably, when I talk to white teachers that are in a group, now if it's mixed or diverse, if you will, I get a different response. But when I talk to white folks of teachers in a group, and I share with them what high expectations look like and low expectations look like, they emphatically says, no, but I do such and such instead, and I do such and such instead. They really push back. And what's been challenging is this belief change with these people, not just teachers, they're humans, this belief change that they've, and oftentimes, and not just in education, but in other spaces that we're talking about, oftentimes they feel that they've done enough or they're doing enough. And so there's no need to change. And there's no room for change. And so therefore there's no interest in changing.
I don't have anything to say to you on that, brother, because I think I agree with you. And I think that also leads people to be complacent about the condition of Black people because they feel like they've done all these things. And it's just now they revert back to the racist ideology that they're lazy, they're criminals, they don't want anything better.
Exactly.
And, one of the things that motivates me, I remember growing up poor. I remember being on food stamps. And I remember all those things, right? I ain't never want to live like that. And when people be framing Black people like they want to live in the kind of communities that are there, like that bothers me because I don't know no Black people that I ever grew up with that said that they wanted to live in that mess.
Yeah.
And so, I think that I don't really have anything to say to you on that, but I think that I think what I'm trying to say is that it almost justifies leaving Black people in the conditions that they are in because they warrant it. They're immoral people. They're criminals, they're lazy, all those things that racism justifies, it kind of supports that. So
both of you, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Jackson.
I was just going to say one really quick point that I think sort of belies both of what you were just saying. I actually think that something we haven't talked about with regard to how people view Black people and how people, view the human condition and where people end up on spectrums of power and achievement and thriving is that people, especially in the United States, have bought full on into the myth of meritocracy, right? Which is if you work hard, you will get exactly what you deserve, right? A hard day's work for a hard day's pay. And I don't think that people recognize, which is what I try to get them to see, right, in my work, is that meritocracy is a farce, right? Meritocracy is a farce. People have ended up in their conditions based on structured racism and structured oppression, right? I didn't just find myself overrepresented in poverty. You denied me access to intergenerational wealth by leaving me on the side of the road with no economic floor, right? That's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? After slavery, there was no 40 acres and a mule. And even if there were, There was no real attempt to dismantle a system that said, even with 40 acres and a mule, I am an equally deserving human being. So part of what I do with white people and white teachers and white teacher educators is to unveil the white racialized experience through a lens of privilege and empowerment. Because the only thing that disrupts a system of perfect meritocracy, where everybody gets what they deserve every time, is privilege. And that's why I sort of anti-hegemonically center whiteness. I anti-hegemonically center the white racial experience, because most white people feel completely content with not only their lot in life, but the disproportionately oppressed lot of people of color, and especially Black people, because they've bought full on into the idea that people have gotten where they've gotten based solely on individual effort. And that is a farce. And I just wanted to make sure we address that, because that's why people become complicit and content, because they don't realize that meritocracy is a lie.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So family, we are at 6:22, and both of you have told me separately that you have another engagement after we leave here. Oh my gosh. We only touched a little bit maybe of the topic areas that we outlined.
You know what happened, Dr. Coleman? You told us that we could express what was on our mind, and that just did
Absolutely.
it. That just
Oh.
did it.
It was too
look,
organic.
You put two people who think about race and racism all the time together and said, share it, whatever you're thinking about, a topic that you study, eat, breathe, and
Yes.
sleep all the time.
And I wouldn't have it any other way. I work with both of you closely, separately, and now together. I wouldn't have it any other way. The only thing is just that I have to manage the time, and honor your time for that matter. So it's now 6:23. There are a few topic areas that we have thought to open up to that we'll just have to wait until another time, right? Possibly. Racism and non-Blacks, especially around Asian hate, if you will, and Latinx, especially Mexican immigrants and Cuban immigrants and those coming from our southern borders. So, I mean, those are topic areas that are important. I want our audiences to know, and future YouTube watchers to realize that these topics did not miss us. It's just that we can go on for a few hours around the topic of race and racism. And it's not really race and a pandemic. They both are happening at the same time, right? If you don't mind, I'd like to open it up for the last few minutes to the other audience to see if there's a question or two that we can respond to. So I'm looking out into the world of of internet, and are there any questions from our audience? If there are, just please put them in the YouTube chat. If I can speak, I'd be dangerous. While I'm waiting for questions, we do have a comment here from a YouTube participant. Consider the comment the Disney executive made to Shonda Rhimes when she asked for an extra ticket to the park. His response was, "Don't you have enough?" So that's speaking to some folks, not some random folks. The influence of white institution and white power suggesting that they've done enough for Blacks, if you will.
Can I just say something really quickly? That and then I'll subsequently hop off. But that reminds me of when Oprah Winfrey went shopping, and the store that would ordinarily happily sort of shut down to the public, to allow a celebrity to shop in peace. I think it was Hermes. I'm not quite sure, but it reminded me of that, right? It reminds me of when Dr. Henry Louis Gates was arrested on his own porch as the world, you might argue, one of the premier scholars on African-American literature and history. It reminds me of when multi-million-dollar Black athletes get pulled over and they may not live to tell about it either. So basically, I think what's brought to mind when I think about Shonda Rhimes and her multi-billion-dollar contribution to Disney and anywhere she takes her art is that no matter how wealthy you are, you will never be able to buy down your Blackness. Whiteness is under no obligation whatsoever to respect Blackness, Black people, or Black culture. And so part of what I do in my work is to get them to recognize that we are all worthy of dignity and respect. Now, it's a little harder to make, arguments about how celebrities should have special treatment, right? Or rich people or wealthy people should have special treatment. So I know there are some intersections, but I think that when hyper wealthy, famous people who are Black are treated and reminded and brought down to size, right? It reminds us all that no matter how wealthy you are, you will never be able to buy down your Blackness and the significance of your skin and the respect that you deserve, but routinely don't get. So I don't know who put that comment in the chat, but I'm deeply grateful for that comment. And Dr. Coleman, Dr. Davis, audience, I am deeply grateful for your questions and your participation tonight, but I'm gonna hop off and I'm gonna say thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you.
Take good
Great
care.
talking with you.
Dr. Davis, it's just you and me. Before we jump off, Dr. Davis, do you mind talking about just sort of highlighting our book chapter that's coming out soon around police brutality in the pandemic for Black males?
Yeah, so several of our good colleagues, led by Dr. Kameta Harrison, Dr. Whitney Edmonds, and help me out with the last one, Sean. Shanita.
We'll call her Professor Shanita because I can't remember her last name right now.
Yeah, me either. That was the part that was throwing me off.
And I'm sorry.
They have a new book coming out about the Black experience navigating higher education in the virtual world. And Dr. Coleman and I, Clyde Dowdy, did I pronounce his last name right?
I think it's Dowdy. Yes, I believe so.
Dowdy. We have a chapter focused on 3 Black men sharing our perspectives of police brutality, COVID, and racism, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that we seek to articulate is sort of like what this session with Dr. Jackson highlighted, is that racism is never ending for Black males. And that if anything, during this pandemic, it's even heightened their experiences and their risk for not only contracting COVID, but experiencing police brutality because of the results of racism. And we offer our perspectives on how Black men are impacted by COVID, racism, and the pandemic. And we also offer solutions. I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about what we do. If we talk about problems for Black people, we also have to offer solutions.
Yes.
And so in that piece, we kind of center what we are calling the never-ending racial pandemic and offering solutions on how we address that through, as a community.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Davis. And so that book and then the chapters therein soon come. And we hope to offer some perspective around racism, the pandemic, and in our case, police brutality with Black boys and men. But we was not able to really get to hunker down in solutions in our discussion today, but oh my gosh, there's so much left on the table to talk about.
I think there is, Dr. Coleman. And I think that the one thing that I would say that I took from Dr. Jackson, I take from you, and I would say myself included, is that we all have to do our part. And we're all trying to do our part, but we have to figure out what is that in our own lane. And I was always taught there's no end. We do it until we get old. We just keep fighting for our people.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of the principle that I kind of govern my thinking on and my actions.
Well, I tell my children that I don't think there's I don't have a retirement age.
Yeah.
I'm not going to retire. That's just where I've been trained. So
yeah.
Dr. Davis.
Your mentor is a great example of that.
Yeah. But sometimes we call him our tormentor as well. Dr. Davis, brother, good colleague, family, my friend, I appreciate you coming on board today and kicking off this speaker series. One of the participants who's a student soon to be, Dr. Allen, if you will, outstanding. This is a rich discussion. Thank you, panelists. We had a couple other folks who said, just say thank you. This is a great discussion. So, and I personally, professionally, as you know, so appreciate you good brother. I want to close out by giving a couple directions. My class itself, then the registered students to the class, you have a separate Zoom link that we will jump on at 6:50. Got about 20 minutes to get some water. I got 20 minutes to get some water and the transition to class. So 6:50, I'll see you on the Zoom link. I want to give a thank you, yes, to you, Dr. Davis, Dr. Taharee Jackson, and those who supported this effort. We have Bowie State University Conference Services, Miss Wedderburn, who
Yes.
we call the virtual god, if you will. She is the behind the scenes making all this happen. So thank you, thank you, thank you, Miss Wedderburn. She
Absolutely.
made sure I'm behind the scenes emailing her, Miss Wedderburn, are we sure we're good? She's like, I got you. It's okay. So thank you for.
And it is literally like that all
Yeah,
the time. Like
absolutely.
you could be in a panic and she like, all right, I got this.
Yes.
And then it all just comes together the way, in many cases, beyond your expectations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you, Ms. Wedderburn. Your reputation continues and preceded you for that matter. And yes, Dr. Davis did hook me on to your thank you. Absolutely. I want to also thank my son, Nicholas Coleman, who has been a staunch supporter. Both my sons are support. Nicholas Coleman is my in-house resident tech expert. He does my my backgrounds. He does my flyers. And I actually take his advice, not just say, give me, if you will, like do this as a chore kind of thing. Say, hey, what do you think? Oh, no, Dad, I think this and I think that. And this is the reason why I think I like this one. So he's actually, fully invested in this initiative and this type of work as well. He's also on the Zoom, just in case he wanted to jump in. So I appreciate my family for being so supportive of these efforts. So thank you. With that, he said, thanks, Dad, in the chat. No, thank you, son, so very much. With that being said, families, I'm going to close shop here. We have on tap next week, Racism and Economics with our guest discussant, Dr. Latanya Brown Robertson, who is a full professor of economics at Bowie State University. We'll talk more about racism and we'll hone in on economics in particular, and she's an expert. So stay tuned. I'll be sending the flyer out again sometime this week as a reminder, and thank you for being here.